What I'm pointing to is that marriage itself is not the thing that makes sex moral. There is something else, and I think we've forgotten what that something else is.
Oh, the suspense. All right, ladies and gents, welcome back to Offbeat POV. My name is Chin, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Fatani.
Your favorite girl, Fatani.
And Pronik, good to be back. Very, very excited about today's conversation.
Okay,
Actually.
why are you excited about today's conversation?
Because it's a conversation that's not had openly, that's not had properly. It's a conversation that I feel like, let's definitely make it part of a Christian upbringing, a Christian youth.
I feel like as Pronik has
discussion.
so much to say, he should introduce the topic. Because now when he comes to saying the word, like the topic today.
Okay. All right. Well, let me tell you guys why Pronik is excited, because we have a very special guest with us today, all the way from
Virginia.
Was it?
That's right.
Virginia.
Yeah,
Yes,
your
we sound
mother-
so foreign.
Your
don't we?
mother tongues really came out.
Listen, we're British, okay? We're not Americans. There's weird names. Anyway, we have a very special guest all the way from Virginia today, Dr. Kevin Jenson, who is the author of a book titled Sacred Not Sinful. It's a very interesting book. The idea, the concept, I guess where it sits in culture is it's an interesting book, an interesting take.
Yeah.
So we're very, very happy to have you here,
And very
Dr.
lucky.
Kevin Jenson. Welcome. How are you?
Thank you. It's really good to be here. I've enjoyed our conversation and look forward to spending some time together.
Amazing.
Fantastic. So we're going to dive straight in then. So Kevin, if you just want to tell us a little bit about where Sacred Not Sinful came from. Especially the title. Where did that come from?
Yeah. Well, this book I actually wrote under the working title of Christian and Sex Positive. And that title came from a friend of mine who's a sex educator. I was on his podcast a few weeks ago, and he sent me a message saying, "Do you mean to say that you are Christian and sex positive?" And so I wrote the book under that title. But as I was working on it, I started to realize, what I have here is my story of how I went from Christian and sex negative, really, or Christian and afraid of sex, where everything to do with that was covered in shame and fear and uncertainty, to being able to approach sex as something sacred, not sinful. And I had to go through a long journey with the Bible, with God, in conversation with people in my life to reach that point. And I think I was in conversation with somebody one day, and I just said, well, this is where the book can take you. If you read the story, it's not about being Christian and sex positive. It's about understanding that sex is something sacred, not something sinful, and kind of shifting that conversation within the Christian paradigm has been my goal with it.
Oh, brilliant.
Intriguing.
It's very okay. So let's go back a little bit, and I want to start with sex positive, right? Could you just define that for me, or explain that to me?
Yes. I think when that term is used in modern culture, people tend to be sex positive, like everything about sex positive. And that's part of the reason why I shifted the title away. Because I think that when we have something like human sexuality, which is something sacred, to approach it without an understanding of what it is and without honoring what it is, that's not something I can be positive about. At the same time, we have something in Christian culture where our ignorance about sexuality, our ignorance about how to experience it in ways that align with our integrity, that have us experience freedom, where we feel skillful and powerful and holy. Since we don't have any of that, we tend to hide sex away. And we don't want to talk about it because the only thing we know about sex is how to get it wrong. And so really sex positive, I think, has emerged in culture as an opposition to this sex negative or sex fearful or sex ignorant context. And so that's how I would be using that term, is instead of ignorance, let's have knowledge. Instead of fear, let's have freedom. Instead of guilt, let's have forgiveness. Let's have intimacy with God as the starting point of how we experience sex.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I can see why you changed, not changed per se, but with that, I'm understanding a lot more how suiting sacred, not sinful is. Because, and unless if I'm getting it wrong, but you're not saying that everything all in, but it's almost from a point of no, actually, within the realm of what can be done, let's be positive about that. Let's let people know about it. People shouldn't feel ashamed or anything like that, because this is a sacred thing that God put in place. Does that make sense? Whereas if you had gone, if it was just about, let's say, if the title had just been like sex positivity, then I haven't read the book. I'm quoting Dr. Kevin there. Well, he said we can do anything. Like, yo, hold on, slow down. That's just the title. Read the book.
Yeah.
Do you understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah, no, yeah, I get that. Okay, so I want to go back a little bit then, because obviously something led you to focus on the Christian and sex. So I want to understand what
did you see that was wrong in the Christian talk?
Yes.
What were we getting wrong?
So I understand the journey that brought you to the point where you're like, you know what?
This is a topic that needs to be delved into a lot more.
Yeah.
I don't know what all this was.
People need to be freed.
I love that question, because this is my story. I needed to be freed. It wasn't that I was looking around and I'm like, you need to be free, you need to be free. I'm like, I need to be free, because I've been on a Christian journey with God basically my entire life. I was born to missionary parents. I was raised in the church. I was studying Greek by the end of high school, but steeped in the Bible, steeped in Christian culture. And yet there was a detachment in my life from, here's all the Christian things I believe, and then here's like the real world over here. And as I set out on my journey of discovering how God could be part of my life in every part of life, not just on Sunday, not just in my beliefs, but in how I show up in the minute, in relationships, I realized I was experiencing deeper intimacy with God. I was experiencing deeper connection with other people. And for some reason, my desire for sex did not go away. And I said, well, this is a problem, A, because I'm not married, and B, because if you're not a married person within traditional Christian sexual ethics, the only time you're allowed to have sexual desire is after you're married. And I became frustrated because I said, I'm experiencing deeper intimacy with God. This shouldn't be a problem anymore. And it was. I had no capacity to look like, in spite of thinking of sex as something sinful, in spite of knowing all the ways to do it wrong, I had never developed an alternative that was healthy. I didn't have a way of seeing a woman's body for me as something beautiful. It was something, if I were to encounter beauty, if I were to encounter something erotic or sensual, I had to leave it, because I had no way of that being a healthy part of my life. I could not look at someone beautiful because I had two options. My two options were lust, objectify, or look away. And I said, there has to be some third option, some way that I can come to something beautiful, some way that I can be a sexual being, both internally as well as looking around in the world and realizing sex and life are deeply connected, beautiful parts of creation. I needed some way that could be a positive part of my life, connected to my relationship with God, instead of the ultimate enemy to my Christian walk. And so I said, well, everyone who I read all the books. I had a chat with Joshua Harris, author of I Kissed Dating Goodbye, not too long ago. And he influenced me profoundly in my early teen years. And he represents, his book represented the dominant Christian paradigm of purity culture, which is you either do it wrong or you don't do it at all until you get married. Then when it's all okay and there's really no guidelines whatsoever.
Okay, I want to go back a little bit to something you said, which I found very interesting. You said you had two options. You either lust
Or
look away.
or look away, and
Yeah.
there had to be a third option. Did you find that third option?
I believe so. And that is why I wrote the book. So in 2013, I faced this choice because I was in a worship service and I was in a charismatic church where people dance. And I saw the most beautiful girl dancing. And I knew I couldn't appreciate it. I knew I had no capacity to value it as part of worship, to share in that experience of communal worship together. I just couldn't because of my paradigm. The next week, I was in the school of ministry. I sat down next to someone who was a Christian deliverance person. They do something called sozo, which is saved and set free. It's about bringing salvation to every part of life. I didn't even speak to the person. I just sat down next to them, and the Holy Spirit did something. I don't know what it was, but the rest of that day, I went to a coffee shop and I started to write. I said, God, I need a solution. Nobody who I've read has an answer. Guide me. I'm open. I'm frustrated. I'm at my wit's end. This is what happens. And I went to the coffee shop. I wrote the rest of the day. I wrote the rest of the next day. And what I wrote is the theological, philosophical heart of a new approach to Christian ethics. And I said, this is really interesting. This is really scary. I wrote the word sex on a paper. I'm very uncomfortable about this. And I also knew I needed something more than a new intellectual paradigm. Before I started to share this, I had to find out if it actually worked in my life. And so I would say the past 10 years since I sat down and wrote that have been testing, developing, growing into becoming that free person, becoming that person who lives in that third way, being able to experience my sexuality, this thing God created as part of my life, as something beautiful that I can experience with integrity, with freedom, and with skill. So these are the three things that I say, all right, this is where I feel like I've come to. Sacred Not Sinful, this book, again, shares my journey from my point of frustration to the first times when I realized, oh, this is possible, to when I started to integrate this into my life, down to the point of decision where I realized that even though it would be much easier keeping this a secret because sex is a very controversial topic, I needed to share it. And so all of that is in my book, Sacred Not Sinful, just that unfolding journey, because it took place over 10 years. It's quite a long story. And
That's quite a
thanks
long
for
time.
asking.
So how does that then, obviously you gave your three ways, how does that translate practically in your everyday life? So
Integrity, freedom, and skill.
what does that freedom look like? What does it manifest like on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis?
Yeah. I kind of want to make a grid now. I'm like daily, weekly.
On Monday?
Right, on Monday it looks like this. I think one of the biggest areas that I appreciate the most is having come to understand that I can be totally open with God and with myself about what I'm experiencing. It always frustrated me when I would hear a Christian teacher about sexuality come in and they're like, I'm perfect. I figured it all out now. Like I have the answers. No sexual sin, nothing to hide, nothing embarrassing. Like, everything is good now. And I'm like, so since when has something as complex as love, intimacy, or sexuality, which includes every part of our life, been something we arrive at and we say, I'm here now? And So for me, I come in and I share my story as somebody who is in process, on the journey with God, and free to be on that journey. Free to realize 10 years from now that I thought some pretty stupid things back in the day. Free to continue to grow, and when I fall down, to get back up and say, yeah, it's okay. I'm learning. I know where I'm headed. And I know that I can choose this destination. I have an idea of where I'm going, not an idea of the things that I'm trying to avoid, to not do, to not mess up.
Okay. I want to move forward a little bit, forward but sideways. Because I'm hearing what you're saying, and I think it's definitely different to what I guess you'd hear in church.
What is normally preached.
But so what I want to understand is, and I guess this is the first sort of section that I want to go into, is sex before marriage. Because from if I'm understood what you share and what you sort of put out into the world, what we know thus far is sex before marriage is wrong, is always wrong. And then once you get married, just don't talk about it. You know, it's nobody's business, right? So you've come in and you've said, no. You know,
Let's have a conversation.
This clearly, you know, isn't serving anyone in the best way. So I want to start by this conversation of sex before marriage. In your revelation, in your journey, in your point of view, offbeat POV, in your point of view, what just about sex before marriage? Is it always wrong? Or is there situations where it can actually be in the way that God intended it to be?
Or is it always wrong, but God forgives it, so it's fine? Mitigating circumstances.
Again, with the multiple options. I love this. You all sound like the inside of my brain sometimes. It's like,
we love that. We love that. That's what we want to hear.
And you have also hit on, this is probably the most sensitive aspect of my work for a lot of people. And it's actually an area where I'm growing, because as somebody who's been on this journey for 10 years, it's easy to forget that 10 years ago, there is no way I could have imagined anything different than the paradigm that I grew up with. I grew up with the traditional Christian teaching that anything sex before you're married is sin. And there was this line of people weren't quite sure where sex began. And so we're like, okay, so is it like if you see someone and they're, you know, like wearing a bathing suit, not fully covered in a dress if they're a woman, or is it, you know, when you touch them for the first time, like holding hands, is that like, and there's this idea of like kind of a slippery slope, and it probably moves from hand holding to kissing to close touching to the clothes come off to like you touch intimate body parts to ultimately we have this idea, and I'm not exactly sure how explicit you can be here in this podcast, but of sexual intercourse as being this, now we know you crossed the line. But up until that point, we're not quite sure. You might have maybe crossed the line. And there's this ambiguity then around the body, around relational intimacy. There's openness, surprisingly, in at least how I grew up. There's openness to deep spiritual intimacy of a kind that I would consider today even inappropriate, especially if you don't bring a full balance of yourself into that relationship. So there becomes all of these little complicated questions of how far is too far, and where is the line, and what are we allowed to cross? I was one of those people who said, I believe this is a sin, therefore I'm not going to do it. I said, if I have sex, I feel like this is the ultimate thing to disconnect me from God. I cannot do it. And yet I want it. And I know I'm not supposed to, but I do. And I also have a very negative experience of this desire. I have no way of it being a healthy part of my life. And yet, in spite of not being married, I hit puberty. And here it is. So what do I do?
What do you do?
Right? Well, this is where I have a phrase now that has become a favorite of mine, and that is ignorance is the enemy of intimacy.
Okay. Interesting.
The problem that I faced was not a problem of having sexual desire, of being created as a human being with sexuality. The problem was one of ignorance about what sex was and how sexuality was part of my life and how it could be a part of my life in a healthy way. I didn't know that because nobody talked about sex. And when they talked about it, it was don't have intercourse until after you got married. Or don't look at porn. That's the other big conversation. But there's never this, well, how do we take this desire which God gave us and use it in a way that produces something positive in our life? And since that conversation didn't happen, I was ashamed of it. I felt guilty for everything I experienced. And I wasn't able to be intimate with God or with other people about something that was a huge influence in my life, which led ultimately to a detachment from relationships. So my starting point here is really quite negative. Like, I did the stuff, I followed the rules, but it led me to a really awful place of feeling isolated, disconnected, and at war with myself.
Interesting.
So I guess where is that line then? So obviously we've spoken about the hand holding, hugging, and kissing, and petting, and then heavy petting. I think people call it bases now.
No, it used to be called bases.
So what
I
is
think
it
it's
now?
updated now.
It used to be bases.
Like,
So
just going back
what is it
years.
now?
I don't know, but you can't say people call it bases now. It's
Stages?
moved. I don't know.
I'm guessing the young people probably have.
Scooby-Doo Pop.
I don't know what the common lingo is now.
I know. I'll go back to what I know. Obviously, back then we used to call it stages: base, first base, second base, third base. So I guess when it comes to at what base does it get sacred? I guess that's my question. At what base does it get sacred? And is it the act that's sacred, or is it the feeling of sexuality that's sacred?
No, I'm not, just to add to that before you come in. I could relate to what you're saying so much. You know, like you gripped me in what you were explaining, and I was just like, oh, what's the answer then? What's the answer then? What is he gonna say? Because everything you were explaining there are things that I once went through myself, and you're definitely right. Definitely in the Christian community, for us Africans especially, it also comes from in the household as well. But talking about in the Christian community, it was not really addressed. You're kind of left to your own devices to like figure it out. You know, it's like you're 12 years old, and then there's silence, and then suddenly you're 20 or 25 married, and then you
Go
can
do
talk
it.
and then, and then it's like you can talk about it again. There's like a void.
But no, you can talk about it for one day.
No,
the
I don't.
wedding day, and then
Well, I don't mean with
about it.
adults and stuff, but I mean as in even with your peers now, it's like a conversation now you can openly have. But then there are some years that are missing. You see, and I don't know about you, but from what he was explaining, I went back to when I was 12, 13, 14. I was actually following, you know. So I'm just adding to that. Say that. So if you could like to our young Christians listening today that are gripped just like we as well, listening to you, trying to figure out, oh, finally, I could get my answer, you know? Where is
all these tingly feelings inside me? What do I do with them?
Should they not feeling attraction or sexual attraction to the opposite sex, for example, you know, or should they not be feeling lust? And if they are in relationships, which, you know, it's fine, because if you're gonna marry someone, you're gonna start dating them, you know, where should they draw the line? You know, should they not hold hands? Should then we can talk about physically, and then we can come to is there a line? You know, so we can talk about physically, and then we can come to the spiritual aspect, because you said something interesting where a spiritual connection that now would deem inappropriate because it was too deep, you know. So we can come to that aspect, but for now, on the physical side, for our listeners, where's the line?
I feel like you're
Yeah.
asking for yourself.
Hang on,
You
hang
keep saying for your listeners, but I feel like low key, this is.
Tronic is like, I listen
I'm
to
listening
you.
Listen, you're never too old to learn the right thing, okay?
Yeah.
Forbid I've been getting it wrong all these years. I was this year old when God saved me.
So I love the questions, and I realized that I didn't bring us all the way to an answer. I really gave us our starting point. And I appreciate this follow-up question because it reflects a paradigm that is dominant in our Western way of thinking right now. And that is one that is looking for, I want something that is measurable, observable, verifiable. This is the scientific method. If you can't see it, it's not real. This is materialism. This is Western materialism that we've inherited. And we've then brought that back into our sexual ethics, thinking of sex as potentially something that is only physical.
Physical.
And what I make a case for is that part of the sacredness of sex is that it touches every single part of your being. It touches you physically, it touches you relationally, it touches your psychology, how you think, the emotions you feel, and most importantly of all, it touches you spiritually. And so when people are looking for the line, they're often looking for that physical line. But the physical line may look different for everyone. For me, that line was kissing. I couldn't kiss another person without feeling like I had violated my standard for intimacy.
Okay.
And again, the same thing happened with hand holding. I could never touch another person in a healthy way because touch had been so sexualized in my life. And I was always jealous of those people who could hug their friends and like cuddle with each other. And it was amazing. And I was like, how do you, like, you all are brothers and sisters. How are you cuddling with each other? That for me was on the other side of the line. And it was on the other side of the line because I didn't know how to have a healthy relationship with my body. I didn't know how to have a healthy experience of touch, of intimate touch with another person, because all of it was potentially sex or part of that ambiguous, slippery slope to the place that you're not supposed to go. So instead of answering the question, where is the physical line, this observable thing that I can say, well, did you do this or not? We got to know if you sinned or if you didn't sin. And say, no, like, do you actually know yourself and what this particular thing means to you and where this activity sits in relationship to the person you're with in your current walk with God and how it would affect you? And so for me, I will say, whatever that line feels like it is for you, where if you cross over it, it's taking you out of integrity with yourself, taking you out of relationship with that other person, where you trust each other, out of your connection with God, where you know, yes, I want you here present with me in this moment. I think those are really good indicators of where the line is. And I think that line is going to look different for every single one of us based on our circumstances and how healthy we are in each of these areas.
Okay. You were saying interesting all throughout that. What were you thinking?
No, I was saying interesting because Kevin mentioned something that I've always thought of as well. Yeah, when he was talking about sometimes you look for a physical limitation or a physical explanation, and whereas it's not that simple in my words. Yeah, and I think for me that explains a lot of even if we go back to our discussions, like, I mean, don't stone me, but like horror movies and lottery, these kind of like grayish areas. Yeah. I'm pointing at, yeah, don't worry about it. It's just an example.
Let's carry on.
When we go into those areas, if I was to sum up what the pastor is saying, what the doctor is saying, so we had a pastor on our show last week.
Calling everyone.
What the doctor is saying, it's almost like the spirit will guide you. So it's almost like the line is different for everybody, depending on where you on where you
On your
are in
journey.
your walk with God. Yeah. So for example, one could come and say, I would like what he was saying. I wouldn't kiss. One would be like, no, I can kiss, but I can't, touch her body. One can be like, oh, I can hold her hand, but I can't kiss. That's kind of like what I'm understanding you to say. So it's not that there's a one rule fits all. It's almost like
let the
There's a
spirit lead.
spectrum.
let the spirit lead. So that's why I'm saying that it's interesting. I didn't say I'm agreeing. I'm just saying it's interesting.
So I guess my question then would be, or my thought point would be, would the spirit then, given what I believe the Bible says about sex before marriage, would the spirit lead to that act of physical intimacy in the sense of sexual intercourse in its real sense?
Yes.
Would the spirit lead to that, or is it have I got the wrong end of the stick because I've already misunderstood what the word sex means?
It's not. I mean, he's gonna come in. Can I? No, of course. Obviously, I'm following so much. I could be him. I'll be your ambassador. No, it's if you're gonna say, okay, your question is a very good question.
I know, that's why I asked.
But what I'm saying, but the thing is that you've already started with sex as a no. You see, so you've already drawn a line there that no, you can't.
No, but that's why I'm asking the question. I'm not drawing the line. My question is solely based on, I'm saying I have an understanding of what sexual intercourse is. So I'm saying, would the spirit lead you to that based on my understanding of what sexual intercourse is? And then my caveat to that was, but then have I reached that? Have I asked that question based on what Dr. Kevin said? Because I don't actually understand what the word sex itself means. So to me, I'm going from, when I say sex, I'm meaning
intercourse.
Intercourse. The rumpy pumpy. That's what I'm meaning. But am I then asking the question that would the spirit lead you to sex? Because I've already got that image in my head of what sex is.
Then the answer would be, I mean, I don't know his answer. My answer, based on what I'm understanding, would be yes. Yeah, go on, doctor.
Oh, I was going to say, take it away, Professor.
See, it works, Dr. Professor.
It's good. Your question is a really critical question. And I think there's two things that I want to say to approach it. One of them is that there tends to be two responses from people who identify as Christian when it comes to that question. And the traditional Christian moral sense has been, here is the line: you don't have sexual intercourse until after you're married. Some of the other stuff we're a little bit iffy about. Is kind of in the gray area. Just don't talk about it. And you probably shouldn't, but like, we're not totally sure that you shouldn't. And if you do, you kind of feel bad about it. And then you're like, I'm getting married anyway, so it's probably okay. The other side of it are people who eventually, when they reach this place of, maybe we call it sexual liberation without being married, tend to dismiss that the Bible has anything to say at all. And they're like, I'm a Christian. Jesus saved me. I can do whatever I want. There's some antiquated rules in the Old and New Testament. And, I eat bacon and I wear mixed fabrics and I have sex with whoever I want. And so there tends to be either you're here or you're
there.
Yeah. You're with God and you're not having sex, unless it's with the partner you married and you're monogamous and you're heterosexual, or your other option is to dismiss the whole thing altogether. And where I come into this conversation is actually right in the middle.
Okay.
Because I think that the Bible does say something. I think it says something that's really important for us to hear. And I don't want to dismiss it. And I also don't want to oversimplify it. I think that when you're talking to children, oversimplification is good. You're a parent of a 5-year-old. They have a colorful red ball that rolls out in the middle of a street. There's traffic coming. Child runs towards the street. Parent is like, you know, like, you need to understand the velocity of traffic coming towards you. You need to know, like, how alert these drivers are probably going to be this time of day, how much light there is outside, whether or not they're going to see you, if they have time to stop. Parent doesn't say any of that. They're just like, don't go in the street.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a fair point.
Really good for the child. But now you have an 18-year-old and they're like, well, I need to, like, you know, they're really trapped their whole life because there's streets everywhere. And all they can remember is don't cross the street.
Don't go out on the streets.
Mhm.
But you need to
Nobody
know
ever
why.
teaches them how.
Exactly.
I think you all are grasping the parallel here.
Yeah. No, that's a very good analogy to sort of drive home the point you're making. And I think that analogy, I mean, I was getting it in black and white. When you said that, it just became in color. Like I could see it. I understood it. So, but then I think the question still remains: how does this 18-year-old now cross the road? I guess it's where we're at now.
Yeah.
Okay. So how is he crossing the road? Or rather, maybe what's the right way to cross the road is probably a better way of phrasing it.
Yes. Because the right way isn't to say you're 18 now, you can go cross the road.
No.
Yeah,
because the dangers of the road still exist,
haven't changed.
whether you're 12 or 18.
Right. And this is why we have so many cases, I think, of sexual abuse within marriage, or sexual dissatisfaction within marriage, or of sexual unfaithfulness within marriage, is because simply hitting 18 and saying, okay, you've reached the ages where you can now cross the road, or getting married and you're like, well, now you can do this, doesn't change anything about never learning how to do this. Never learning how God can be present in this. And you have a lot of, I'm beyond the scope of your question just a little bit, but sometimes people will say it's hard to flip the switch on the wedding night from something being bad your whole life to now it's suddenly good. And the people who experience the most suffering through this are actually women. And so that's a place that we may decide to go. But I need to bring one more thing into the conversation now. And that is, a big part of this book is actually unpacking the scriptural concepts of porneia and of adultery. And I had to do that because I believed that somewhere in the Bible there was a verse that said, thou shalt not have premarital sex.
Yeah, it doesn't exist.
I don't know if any of you've gone looking for it, but it's like in the book of Third Lamentations or something like that.
Definitely not. No, I think there was a time I did go looking for it, but yeah, no, you won't find it. Not in those words, anyway.
Right. So what I don't want to do is come into a conversation like this and be like, you know, this rule that you got, the parents said don't cross the road, it doesn't really exist. It's not a rule. Like, no, actually, that was a really helpful guideline, a really helpful starting point. Now what you need to do is learn, what does it look like to cross the road with integrity? For some of you, this is going to look like you need a relational commitment of marriage. You need to take responsibility for what happens by opening up this vast connection with another person, this deep intimacy with someone else. If you're not ready to hold that, marriage is a really great container to help you do that. And so I won't discourage anyone from following that path or even from waiting until marriage. What I'm pointing to is that marriage itself is not the thing that makes sex moral. There is something else, and I think we've forgotten what that something else is.
Oh, the suspense. You definitely have us. You have us in out of your
palm of your hand.
We are hanging on every single word you're saying.
Carry on.
I thought his sound went. I was like, no, good part.
Oh, that is interesting, though. Just before he continues, just to emphasize on that, like on the analogy he gave. Yeah, and I like again, in understanding this, I'm putting myself in that position. So as you're talking about this young person, you know, this person in a relationship, I'm putting myself there. I'm seeing myself there, right? I think for me, it's the best way that I can get the point home. Plus, it's also the best way that I can then, you know, go back and share the point. You know, and the question I'm getting an answer, but I want to get it in a more clarified way that says that, you know what, this is the point. Does that make sense? This is if I go and say that, you know what, you need to go read Sacred Yet Sinful.
Not
Not sinful. Sacred Not Sinful.
That's a
Wow,
completely different book.
that's a different message. That is a whole different message.
Here.
If I go
It's
and say
built
that,
into you. Don't worry.
if I go and say that, you need to go read this book, it's because I know that they're gonna get the answers there.
Yeah.
So so I'll just emphasize on that to say that where you left us there, that word, you just need to finish that word you're gonna say.
All right.
Explanation.
That next explanation, that thing, that's what brings it home. But I'm really, really enjoying this conversation, to be fair.
Yeah. Same here. I love all of your questions and how you're tracking with me and this curiosity, as well as the focus on, okay, this is really the point that we have to get to. And I will let us get here in a few more minutes. But I want to give one more analogy before we go into this. And I'm debating in my mind between two different options. I'm going to go with, well, you all drive cars, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Are there people who have licenses to drive who really don't know how to drive?
Yes, me. No, I'm kidding.
But yes, yeah.
Some that I've forgotten maybe how to drive.
Right. So
no, we know an auntie that everybody knows an auntie that has a license that really should not be on the road.
Exactly.
And she passed on her 37th try.
So I used to be a driving instructor. And so I would get people who did not know how to drive. And they could sit in a class and they could learn some things about it, but ultimately they had to get in a car with me and I had to be like, this is a steering wheel, this is how you accelerate. And we had to learn how to do things physically with the car. We had to learn how to do things relationally with the traffic. We had to understand where they were scared of things, what was going to make them freeze up instead of choosing the right decision. They had to know how to read the signs. It's a long, complicated process learning how to drive. You don't just get a certificate and now, I have a license, that means I know. And I'm going to give you now the significance that I think is present in sex. I think that sexual intimacy opens up your life to the life of another person. It is one of the most spiritually, physically, relationally, psychologically vulnerable moments you can share with a person. I think that is the kind of intimacy we're created for with God and the kind of intimacy we're created for with each other. But I can't just give you a license and say, you know how to do this. If I did that, you'd be like, you're stupid. You're sending people out to kill someone. There's a huge amount of risk. But imagine everybody was super scared of being, I'm the bad driver. Everybody knows I'm the bad driver because I asked a question like, which way is left? And everybody laughs at you and they're like, how could you not know the answer to that question? Everybody knows this. Or you get on the highway and you're like, I have to go, 40 kilometers an hour or something because that's what the sign says, but everybody else is going 50 and now you're endangering traffic. Right? So how do we approach sexuality with the amount of ignorance we have around it, with the amount of fear we have of asking a question, of even saying, yeah, I want to have sex, even though I'm not married. How do I deal with this? Somebody's like, well, you're not supposed to. So stop. If we don't get educated about how this impacts us physically, spiritually, relationally, psychologically, there's no way for us to make an ethical decision. We're just completely unprepared for it. And I don't care whether you have the marriage license or you don't have the marriage license. If you never learn, you're opening up something you don't know how to hold. You don't know how to carry.
Okay. Right. There's two directions in my head that I'm
3 directions. Go on.
I'm stood at. I'm trying to pick one. But okay. So from what I'm understanding, from what I'm hearing you say, your big focus, I guess, is less on the physical and more on the spiritual. or on the spiritual, on the emotional, on the
Understanding,
psychological,
talk about it, be
so
open.
yeah, so he's coming from a point of it's about where someone is on their spiritual journey,
Yes,
or where they are on their growth journey, and in
also the
essence,
fact that you have to learn.
it's something that stood
have
out to
to
me
know.
was saying that is this thing that you're going to do, is it going to take you away from the presence of God? Is it going to make you fall out of integrity in whatever it is you're walking off? I heard that really stood out to me. That I think that's a profound eye to look at things through. It's a really interesting question to ask yourself, and I think
You can apply
the
it to more
reason
than just
the reason it
this.
stood out to me is because I think that's a good rule of thumb for a lot of things, actually. To ask yourself, is this thing that I'm partaking or indulging in, is this causing me to
Stray from
drift from is God? It pulling me further away from God, or is it bringing me closer to God? Right. And I think that's the point he was well, that's what I'm understanding, one of the points he's saying. I think that's very, very important.
So while you're still here, guys, just want to say a massive thank you for staying and for listening. Please like and subscribe, and we hope you're enjoying the conversation. Please put your thoughts in the comments because we would love to hear your views.
I think it's important what he said about it's not nothing or mentality.
Yes.
Where it's either nothing or it's everything.
It's everything, yes.
So and I think from what I'm hearing him to say, he's emphasizing very heavily on the middle ground, right?
Yes,
it's not nothing, but it's not everything goes.
Exactly.
So I guess then to throw it back to you, Doctor, you brought up the word porneia, which I think is commonly understood to be the root word for pornography and sexual immorality and stuff like that.
Is that what it is? I thought it was a vegetable.
So then I guess when I said the path has been clear in my head, I was like, okay, that's fine. If this is what we're saying, let's flip switches a bit and talk about sexual immorality, right?
Yes.
What does that look like? Because
if we are adopting the middle
from what I'm understanding, you are acknowledging that is a thing. There is such a thing as sexual immorality,
which means that not
there is such
everything
thing
goes.
as exactly, yeah. So there is a way of doing it wrong.
Yeah.
In going back to analogy, there's a way of crossing the road wrong, right? So what is that sexual immorality? Let's dwell on that for a little bit.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked. This is where I wanted to go in our conversation as well.
Okay.
Because when you're a child and as an educator, I recognize that it's important to have checkpoints and milestones along the way. You don't just say, all right, you're 18, now you're an adult. You never teach somebody how to be an adult. They're just, they're going to be an older child.
Yeah.
And this has happened a lot in our world these days. And I think particularly when it comes to sex. And so you have things like the law. I'm just borrowing this, like the law of Moses. You have these standards, these things throughout the Bible. And there are two that are very clearly emphasized. One of them is do not commit adultery. And what adultery means is to have sex with a woman who belongs to another man. Adultery is a violation of property rights, and it's connected to the ancient system of patriarchy where women were property of the men. Adultery does not put a restriction on male sexual activity. It puts a restriction on the sexual activity of a married woman. So how do we then today process the way that culture functioned, where the woman and her sexuality were the property of the man for a specific procreative purpose, with our world today where we see men and women as created equal? This idea of in Christ there is no male nor female. We no longer like own one another in that same way. There is this level of equality we approach in our relationships. The elevation of woman that happens in the New Testament changes how we process what we receive from the Old Testament. That's one of the three words I want to touch on. So that's a guideline. If your sexual activity is going to cause harm and chaos in somebody's relationship, don't do it. That's the clear thing we can learn from the concept of adultery. from the concept of porneia, which is the second big concept, is sexual immorality. What porneia means is a big mystery to most people in the church, because when somebody reads in the New Testament, all the people who are porneia and adulterers are going to say, go to the lake of fire, or they cannot inherit the kingdom of God. The preacher, whoever's teaching, usually follows that up by saying, well, porneia means A, B, C, D, things that I think are probably a sin. And you get a different set of things depending on who's teaching it. And when I found this out, I said, well, somebody has to go in and like investigate this. And there's a lot of incredible scholarship on this word. And ultimately what it comes down to, there's a couple of possible meanings for it. One could be the sale of sexuality, so commodifying sex. And I think we've done that quite well in our culture. We see that happening quite regularly. The other thing that it means is to be dominated by your sexual desire. And this is the point that the book leads someone to. Is that we ultimately, if we are on a Christian pathway, we're called to intimacy with God, to life in the Spirit. And if you walk by the Spirit, you are no longer doing two things. You are no longer under the law. So no more what's wrong, what's right, where's the line, don't cross it. But you are also no longer a slave to the passions of your body. And so life in the Spirit gives us liberty from two things that would dominate our sexuality. I think on the one side, remember that divide, the duality we talked about, you have a group of people who live under the law and need to know what the law is and are really scared of violating the law and ashamed of probably violating the law. And on the other side are people who are like, forget the law. My body tells me I want this. I'm going to go do that. Both groups of people are slaves to something that Jesus came to set us free from. We're invited to walk by the Spirit and to see the fruit of the Spirit of love, joy, peace, kindness, gentleness, all of this emerging around our sexuality. And so anytime our experience of sex is taking us into darkness, into fear, into shame, into isolation, separation, this is not life in the Spirit. We're called to life, to walk in the Spirit, and then to be free from the law of the body and from the law of Moses. And now this is what Jesus says, and Paul repeats this. He says this: love fulfills the law. If you are able to let that be your guiding light, your love for God, first of all, and your love for others, if you're able to let this be your guiding light and you say, I want to love God more effectively, you're going to go study how to do that. You're going to study the Bible. You're going to develop your spiritual skill. If you want to love another person with your sexuality, you're going to understand the body. You're going to understand skill. You're going to learn what you're working with. You cannot love well with ignorance. So ultimately the call is this. If you want to live under the law, by all means, let's make the law, let's make the line, don't cross the line, because your conscience will condemn you if you cross it, no matter where that line is for you. It's going to separate you from God. If I think your friends think it's okay, but you don't think it's okay, don't cross that line, because it's going to lead you away from intimacy. On the other hand, let's learn how to live in the Spirit, learn how to have that intimacy with the voice of God, so that we know in every part of life, not just in our sexuality, yes, this is good. Yes, this is an expression of love. We have this thing that I want, and we can learn what it looks like and develop skill in that area, develop wholeness, take that journey with God, take that journey with each other, because it's okay to be in process. We're going to be learning our whole life. That is, I think, the invitation. That's the invitation of my book, Sacred Not Sinful.
Interesting.
Oh, listen.
We could be here all day.
We could be here a while. But so just as we are bringing to a close, the last point you made, I can already hear an objection in my head, and I just want to give you an opportunity to sort of address it, right? Because someone could not an object, or maybe a question that someone could
A
ask.
caveat.
No, a question that I can hear some of our audience is
Hey, he
asking.
found his word.
Someone would say that yes, the last point you made about being not under the law, not slaves to our flesh, but under the Spirit and led by the Spirit, masters of our flesh and whatnot. Someone could say, yes, it is for that reason why the Bible teaches no sex before marriage, because yes, we all know that by the time you're 13, 14, you begin your sexual awakening. But then the idea is you control your urges, you control your flesh, you bring that into submission. In a perfect world, you would bring that into submission up until the point
because
where
you've been freed from it and you are now its master, so to speak.
Up to the point where you do get married, and then you're able to explore and enjoy it to its fullest extent, not being led by the flesh, but being mastered with the flesh. What do you think?
I would say two things. One, which will get me in even more trouble. And that is this: the concept of porneia applies whether you are married or not. This choice of being governed by the flesh or governed by the Spirit applies whether you are married or not. And so it's a skill that all of us are called into. So this sexual ethic is equalizing and saying we have to understand how to make this choice. And we have to practice it. We have to learn skills. There are certain things you can do with breath, with the body, with sensations, that will teach you how to navigate that desire. You cannot just say, no, I'm shutting this off until this point. You can try, but it's still going to be there. It's still going to be unhealthy. It's going to fester unless you understand how to move it and channel it through the body, through the mind, through the perspectives, through the way you relate to other people. And you can learn all of these things, which I may develop a course or something to guide people through. I do personal guidance in these things right now because I'm like, hey, once you choose this path, you have to learn how to walk it. And there's not a lot of people teaching you how to walk it. We're just like, well, don't cross the line. But how do we not cross that line wherever we find it to be? So that's part A to your answer. Part B, I'm working on it. I would say follow my blog. No, I seriously, I am. So I'm working on a book right now that I'm titling Polyamory and the Bible, because there is not a good answer to the question, this question, and it's the one that you asked me. Is monogamy the only moral context for sexual intimacy? What does the Bible say? Because the Bible shows us a lot of potentially conflicting examples. Like we talked about with adultery, it was a really unhealthy context. This idea of a woman's virginity and property belonging to a man and all of this, there's all of this chaos happening. The guy can have concubines, he can go see a sex slave. All of this stuff is in the Old Testament. Is that moral? It's never said anywhere that that's wrong. Even I have some scholars, they're like, why was sexual slavery never condemned in the New Testament? This was a common practice in that culture, not even mentioned. How do we choose? And so if we're going on this choice of here's all the stuff we can't do, there's a lot of stuff that's not mentioned. A lot of people try to wrap that into the word porneia, but it's not there. The word porneia is being governed by your desire. That could apply to married, heterosexual, monogamous sex. So what do? I'm attempting to point us towards something good because I think the Bible does give us this picture of what it can be, as opposed to, well, let's figure out where that line is. So I'm wrestling with where that line is in my new book because of that objection. I think it's really important. And I think we need to approach that question without bringing our modern day assumptions into it, recognizing that there was polygamy all the way into the New Testament. Typically, it was only the male with multiple wives. But there are a lot of details that go into that. And so I'm attempting to unpack that and should be publishing more on it in the days ahead.
We shall wait and see.
You know what? I think by God's grace, that is a great place to end the conversation for now. I know
we'll have to pick up again after the new book is out.
I was gonna say
before the new
when
book is out.
when even before apparently, but I was gonna say when that new book is ready to be published, I think we need to have another conversation because and it'll probably be a bit longer next time. And I'll tell you why this is interesting, because you are right in that the topic of sex and the Christendom there is definitely
lacking.
there definitely a lot of dark rooms that still need to be lit.
And it's gotten
Mhm.
worse. To be fair.
Yeah, and the more the world gets sexualized, it's like the quieter
Quite exactly.
the quieter Christians are getting.
Yeah.
When really, no.
It's the louder.
You know, yeah, the teachings about it, you
If
know, the
anything, they're
discussions
now
and everything.
they're needed now even
Now
Mhm.
more than ever,
more than ever.
100%. Which is why I personally was very excited
Yeah.
to have yourself, Doctor, you know, talk a little bit about your book.
Mm.
So just really quickly, where can they get your book? And you mentioned the blog as well.
Yeah.
If you just want to let people know where they can find you.
Sacrednotsinful.com. That's the place you find the book, the blog,
Very original.
podcast. You can find a link to my site from there. Everything's available at sacrednotsinful.com.
Fantastic. Of course, we're also going to post the links to the book and everything on all our sites and everything, so all our followers will be able to see it. And of course, if you're listening to this, then as soon as this is finished, check out Sacred Not Sinful. I imagine they can get a copy on Amazon of the book.
So from my site, you can find a copy at your favorite bookstore, or you can even buy one and get it signed directly from me. So both of those links are there.
There you go. Dr. Kevin Jenson, thank you very much for your time today. We've been left wanting.
You have some incredible questions, by the way, and you all having the courage to tackle this subject and to open it up for people is something that I want to take a moment to honor that, because it takes a lot of courage to ask the question and to hold that tension of discomfort that comes from saying, no, it's not this way that we look at each other and judge each other. Maybe there is more to this conversation than we imagined. I really appreciate the questions you brought to this conversation.
Amazing.
There's definitely more to the conversation.
Okay, so in closing, then I have one final question for you.
Yes.
So the question is, if this is to serve as your last conversation ever, so after this conversation, you're not having any other conversation, no other meetings, no other interview with anyone else.
Gone and done it.
What is your message to the world based on your journey at this very moment? If you could speak no longer going forward, what would your message be to everyone who's listening and to the world?
Your pressure.
Under pressure, pushing down me.
The thing that is most deeply beautiful that underlies all of this, the reason why I'm doing any of this, is because sex is not meant to get in the way of intimacy. It's meant to be a way of experiencing intimacy with God.
You can do your clicks higher.
Oh, that was beautiful. That was beautifully put.
I have to print that as a quote.
Right? I was thinking we're gonna have to write this in